The moment you realize the person you've been looking down on is actually the one who holds your entire future in their hands, it's already too late to apologize. The conference room on the 42nd floor was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, the kind of silence that made people sit a little straighter and check their phones a little less. 12 executives in tailored suits were already seated around the long glass table, their eyes fixed on the empty chair at the head. A digital clock on the wall read 8:59 a.m. No one spoke. They were waiting. Not just for a meeting but for a decision that could end careers. At exactly 9 a.m. the doors opened but no one looked surprised. They all stood up at once, almost instinctively, as if they had practiced it. The sound of chairs sliding back echoed in perfect unison. Still, the camera didn't reveal who had just walked in. Instead, it lingered on one man sitting halfway down the table, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles pale, his breathing just a little too fast. Robert Carter had worked at this company for over 25 years. He had never missed a deadline, never taken an unnecessary day off, never imagined he would be sitting here like this. Across from him a folder lay unopened, his name printed neatly on the tab. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Everyone in the room knew. A restructuring. A necessary adjustment. Corporate language that always sounded polite until it landed on your life. One of the executives cleared his throat, glancing toward the head of the table. "We're ready when you are," he said carefully, his tone respectful, almost cautious. Whoever had just entered hadn't spoken yet. The authority in the room shifted without a single word being said. Robert swallowed hard, his mind racing not just about his job, but about what this would mean for his family. His son Daniel had always been proud that his father worked for such a prestigious company. He talked about it like it was a badge of honor, like it meant something permanent. But nothing here was permanent. Not anymore. Just yesterday, Daniel had been complaining about his wife again, about how Emily didn't contribute enough, how she didn't understand pressure, how she didn't know what it meant to build something from the ground up. Robert had agreed without thinking twice. He had laughed even. Now, sitting in that room waiting for a stranger to decide his future, something about that conversation didn't sit right anymore. The executive spoke again, softer this time. "Before we proceed, would you like to address the situation?" he asked, still not daring to look directly at the person at the head of the table. A brief pause followed. Then finally footsteps echoed lightly across the polished floor, slow, controlled, deliberate. Robert lifted his eyes for the first time, his heart pounding in his chest, completely unaware that in just a few moments, everything he thought he knew about power, about respect, and about the woman his son had been underestimating, was about to change forever. The story of how everything reached this moment did not begin in that conference room, but in a quiet suburban home just outside the city, where everything looked perfectly normal on the surface. Emily Carter stood in the kitchen early that morning, sunlight coming through the window, illuminating the neat counters and the coffee she had just poured. She wore simple clothes, nothing that would ever suggest power or authority, just a soft sweater and jeans, the kind of outfit that made people overlook her without a second thought. Daniel Carter walked in, adjusting his tie, already checking his phone before even greeting her. "Do we have anything decent for breakfast?" he asked, his tone casual but distracted, as if she were part of the background rather than the center of his life. Emily turned slightly, offering a calm smile. "I made eggs and toast," she said gently. Daniel glanced at the plate and gave a small nod, not unkind, but not appreciative either. "Thanks," he said, already scrolling again, his attention elsewhere. It was always like this. Not cruel, not loud, just quietly dismissive. A kind of distance that grew over time without either of them fully noticing when it started. A few minutes later, Robert Carter entered, his presence filling the room more than Daniel's ever did. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he had earned his place in the world through years of hard work. "Morning," he said, taking a seat and reaching for the coffee without asking. His eyes briefly scanned Emily, then moved on. "Big day today," he added, looking at Daniel. "We have a major meeting with upper management. The kind of people you do not keep waiting." Daniel nodded, clearly impressed. "That company is on another level," he said. "I have always said you are lucky to be there." Robert smiled slightly, pride evident in his expression. "It is not luck. It is consistency." You show up, you deliver, you earn respect. That is how it works. His gaze shifted back to Emily, subtle but unmistakable. Some people never quite understand that. Emily did not respond. She simply placed another cup of coffee on the table and sat down quietly, her expression composed, her silence more deliberate than it appeared. Daniel sighed, setting his phone down for a moment. I just wish things were different, he said, glancing at Emily. You have so much free time. You could do something meaningful, you know. Contribute more. The words were not harsh, but they landed heavily in the quiet room. Emily met his eyes for a brief second, her expression unreadable. I do contribute, she said softly. Daniel shook his head slightly, not arguing but not agreeing either. Not in the way I mean, he replied. Robert chuckled under his breath, finishing his coffee. You will learn, he said to Daniel. Some people are just comfortable staying where they are. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up, her posture unchanged, her calm unshaken. There was no anger in her face, no visible frustration, just a quiet awareness that made her seem distant, as if she were standing slightly outside the moment rather than fully inside it. Outside, a car passed by, the faint sound of traffic reminding them that the day was moving forward whether they were ready or not. Daniel stood up, grabbing his jacket. I have to go, he said. Big meeting today. Robert stood as well, straightening his shirt. Same here, he added, a hint of anticipation in his voice. Neither of them noticed the brief glance Emily gave toward the clock on the wall, her timing precise, her thoughts already aligned with a schedule neither of them knew existed. As they walked out the door together, talking about the importance of the meeting, about the people they hoped to impress, about the future they believed was still in their control, Emily remained in the kitchen for a moment longer, the silence returning once they were gone. Then, without hesitation, she reached for her phone, her expression shifting ever so slightly, not into something dramatic, but into something certain. When she spoke, her voice was calm, professional, and completely different from the one they had just heard. I will be there in 10 minutes, she said. By the time Emily stepped out of the house, the quiet version of her that Daniel and Robert believed they understood was already gone, replaced by a presence that carried a completely different kind of weight. The car waiting at the curb was not flashy, but it was precise, clean, and punctual, the kind of detail that reflected intention rather than display. As she entered the back seat, the driver nodded respectfully without needing instructions, already aware of the destination. The city skyline grew larger as they drove, glass buildings reflecting the morning sun, each one holding its own stories of ambition and pressure. Emily looked out the window, her expression calm, but her mind focused, already several steps ahead of what the day required. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. The board is assembled, a voice said through the speaker, professional and direct. They are waiting for your decision. Emily glanced at the time, then replied without hesitation. Proceed as scheduled. I will be there shortly. There was no doubt in her tone, no hesitation, just clarity. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel and Robert walked into the corporate building together, their pace slightly faster than usual, both aware that this meeting carried more weight than they had expected. The lobby was expansive, polished floors reflecting every step, the reception desk staffed by individuals who carried themselves with quiet efficiency. Robert straightened his posture as they approached the elevators. This is where it matters, he said, his voice low but firm. People notice everything here. How you walk, how you speak, how you present yourself. Daniel nodded, absorbing every word, his respect for his father evident. I know, he replied. I just want to make sure we are on the right side of whatever is happening. Robert gave a small, confident smile. We will be. I have built my reputation here for decades. That does not disappear overnight. The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside, joining a few others who stood quietly, each person focused on their own thoughts. As the numbers climbed higher, the atmosphere became heavier, more serious, as if the building itself understood the importance of the floors above. When they reached the 42nd floor, the doors opened to a hallway that was noticeably quieter than the rest of the building, the kind of quiet that signaled authority rather than emptiness. A staff member greeted them with a polite nod and guided them toward the conference room. They are expecting you, she said. Robert acknowledged her with a brief nod, his confidence still intact, though his grip on his folder tightened slightly. As they approached the door, Daniel leaned closer. "Do you know who we are meeting with?" he asked quietly. Robert shook his head. "Only that it is someone at the highest level," he replied. "Someone who does not attend meetings unless it is serious." Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "Well, I guess we will find out." Inside the room, the executives were already seated, their expressions controlled, their attention focused. Robert and Daniel took their seats, feeling the shift in energy immediately. This was not a routine discussion. This was something else. Something final. Robert placed his folder on the table, his hands resting on top of it, as if holding onto something solid could keep everything else from slipping. Daniel glanced around, noticing how no one was speaking, how every movement seemed deliberate, how even the smallest sound carried weight. Then the door opened again. This time the room changed in a way that could not be ignored. Conversation stopped before they even started. Eyes shifted, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. Respect was not requested in this space. It was expected. Daniel felt it before he understood it. A presence entering the room that commanded attention without needing to raise a voice. He turned slightly, his curiosity pulling his gaze toward the head of the table, completely unaware that the answer to everything he had been questioning, everything he had misunderstood, was now only a few steps away from being revealed. The room did not just quiet down when she entered, it shifted, as if every person present adjusted themselves without realizing it, straightening their posture, focusing their attention, waiting without being told to wait. Emily walked forward at a steady pace, her heels making a soft, controlled sound against the polished floor, each step measured, each movement intentional. She did not look around to seek acknowledgement, she did not need to. The acknowledgement was already there. One of the senior executives stood slightly straighter and spoke first, his voice respectful but careful. "Good morning," he said. "We are ready to begin." Emily gave a small nod, her expression composed, her presence calm but unmistakably authoritative. "Let us proceed," she replied, her tone even, clear, and firm in a way that did not require emphasis. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest the moment he heard her voice. It was familiar but not in the way he expected. It carried a clarity and confidence that did not match the quiet tone he had grown used to at home. He frowned slightly, his mind trying to place it, trying to understand why it felt so close and yet so distant at the same time. Robert, on the other hand, was focused on something else entirely. His attention was on the outcome, on the decision that would define everything he had worked toward. He did not look closely at her face yet, not fully. He was still seeing her as a position, not a person. Emily took her seat at the head of the table, placing a folder down in front of her with precise control. The movement was simple, but it carried weight. The executives followed her lead, sitting only after she did, a silent signal of hierarchy that Daniel could not ignore. He shifted slightly in his chair, glancing at his father, who remained composed, though the tension in his hands had not eased. "Let us begin with the restructuring overview," Emily said, her eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on the documents in front of her. One of the executives stood and began presenting, outlining figures, projections, and performance metrics, each word carefully chosen, each number carrying consequences. Daniel listened, but his focus was divided. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she listened, the way the entire room responded to her, that did not align with anything he believed he knew. Robert listened more intently, his experience allowing him to understand the implications behind every statement. When the presentation ended, the room fell silent again, waiting. Emily closed the folder gently, her fingers resting on top of it for a brief moment before she spoke. "Thank you," she said. "Now let us address the individual cases." Her gaze moved across the table, stopping briefly on each person before continuing. When it reached Robert, it paused just for a fraction of a second longer than the others. Not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to register something deeper beneath the surface. Robert felt it, though he could not explain why. He straightened slightly, preparing himself, his mind running through years of performance, achievements, and decisions, searching for reassurance. Emily opened the folder in front of her, her eyes scanning the page, her expression unchanged. "Robert Carter," she said, her voice steady. The name landed in the room with quiet finality. Daniel turned immediately, his attention fully engaged now, his concern no longer hidden. Robert nodded once, acknowledging the moment, his confidence still present, though now tested. Emily looked up from the document, her gaze meeting his directly for the first time. In that brief moment something shifted again, not in the room but within the people sitting in it. Daniel felt it before he understood it. A strange sense of recognition forming at the edge of his awareness, something he could not yet fully grasp but could no longer ignore. Emily held the silence for just a second longer than necessary, then continued, her tone unchanged, her control absolute. We need to review your position and determine the next steps moving forward. Robert took a breath, ready to respond, still unaware that the person guiding this decision was not a stranger, not just an executive, but someone whose presence had already been part of his life in a way he had never truly seen. Robert adjusted his posture, drawing in a slow breath as years of experience guided him into a familiar rhythm, the rhythm of defending his value, of proving that consistency still mattered in a world that seemed to change faster every year. I understand the situation, he began, his voice steady, measured, carrying the confidence of someone who had built his reputation over decades. And I believe my record speaks for itself. I have delivered results, maintained stability, and supported this company through transitions that could have easily gone the other way. His eyes stayed focused forward, not fully meeting hers yet, still addressing the position more than the person. Emily listened without interruption, her expression neutral, her attention precise. She did not nod, did not react, simply allowed the words to settle into the room. Daniel watched closely, his concern growing, but something else was forming underneath it, something harder to define. The way she listened was not passive. It was controlled, intentional, as if every word spoken was being measured against something unseen. Robert continued, leaning slightly forward now, his voice carrying more emphasis. I have never asked for special treatment, he added. Only the opportunity to continue doing what I have always done. I believe that still has value. The room remained still after he finished, the silence stretching just long enough to make the weight of his words settle. Emily glanced down at the document again, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the page before she spoke. Your record is noted, she said calmly. Your consistency is also clear. Her tone did not dismiss him, but it did not affirm him either. Simply acknowledged. Daniel shifted in his seat, his eyes moving between his father and the woman at the head of the table, the connection between familiarity and authority becoming harder to ignore. There was something in the way she spoke, something in the cadence, that echoed in his memory, but his mind resisted it, unwilling to fully accept what it was beginning to suggest. Emily closed the folder gently, the soft sound marking a transition in the conversation. However, she continued, her voice steady, consistency alone does not determine future direction. The words were not harsh, but they carried a finality that made the air in the room feel heavier. Robert's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible sign of strain. With respect, he replied, choosing his words carefully, experience should still matter. Loyalty should still matter. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze directly again, her expression unchanged but her eyes holding something deeper, something that was no longer just professional. It does, she said. But so does awareness. The word lingered, subtle but deliberate. Daniel felt a quiet tension build inside him, his thoughts racing, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the presence in front of him. His mind replayed small moments from the past, conversations at the kitchen table, the way Emily had responded to certain topics, the calmness that he had mistaken for passivity. It no longer felt the same. Robert exhaled slowly, his confidence not gone but now challenged. Then help me understand, he said. What is missing? Emily paused for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, as if choosing the exact point where the conversation needed to shift. Her gaze moved slightly, not away from him, but through him, connecting something beyond the immediate discussion. Understanding, she said quietly, often begins with seeing what has been in front of you the entire time. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different, less like a pause and more like the edge of something about to be revealed. Daniel's heart began to beat faster, the sense of recognition now impossible to ignore. His eyes fixed on her face, searching, questioning, almost afraid of the answer forming in his mind. Emily did not look away. She remained composed, grounded, completely in control of the moment, as if she had already reached a conclusion long before anyone else realized there was even a question. Daniel could not hold it in any longer, the tension that had been building inside him now pushing past the point of silence, his voice breaking into the carefully controlled atmosphere of the room. "Wait," he said, not loudly, but enough to draw attention, enough to disrupt the rhythm that had been so precisely maintained. Several heads turned toward him, surprised, not by the volume, but by the fact that someone had spoken out of turn at all. Daniel swallowed, his eyes fixed on Emily, searching for something that would either confirm or deny what his instincts were telling him. "I am sorry," he added quickly, aware of the setting, aware that this was not his place to speak, but unable to stop himself. "I just need to understand something." Robert glanced at him sharply, a quiet warning in his expression, but Daniel did not look away. He could not. Not now. Emily remained still for a moment, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, as if interruptions did not unsettle her, as if she had already anticipated this moment. "Go ahead," she said calmly, granting permission without hesitation. The room shifted again, this time not from authority, but from uncertainty. Daniel took a breath, his voice steadier now, though the weight behind it was unmistakable. "Have we met before?" he asked. The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but loaded with everything he could not yet say out loud. A faint movement passed through the room, subtle glances exchanged, a silent curiosity building among the executives who had not expected the conversation to take this turn. Robert frowned, confused, his attention moving between his son and the woman at the head of the table. "Daniel," he said under his breath, "this is not the time." But Daniel did not respond. He was waiting. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment longer than before, the calm in her eyes now carrying something more personal, something that existed beyond the role she occupied in that room. Then, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she answered. "Yes," she said. The single word landed with more impact than anything else that had been spoken so far. Daniel felt his chest tighten, his thoughts racing, his mind trying to catch up with the reality that was now unfolding in front of him. "Then why does it feel like I should know you better than this?" he asked, his voice lower now, more uncertain, as if he was stepping into something he was not fully prepared to face. Robert looked at Emily again, this time more carefully, really seeing her for the first time, not just as a position, not just as a decision maker, but as a person. Something about her expression, about the way she held herself, began to feel familiar in a way that unsettled him. Emily did not look away. She let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing both of them to sit in the question, in the realization that was slowly forming but had not yet fully surfaced. Then she spoke again, her voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying a layer of truth that could no longer remain hidden. "Sometimes," she said, "people do not recognize what they are used to seeing every day, because they never really stop to look." Daniel's breath caught slightly, the word striking something deeper than he expected. His mind flashed back to the kitchen that morning, to the quiet presence he had taken for granted, to the voice he had barely listened to the person he had assumed he understood. The contrast was impossible to ignore now. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair, his confidence no longer steady, his thoughts shifting rapidly as he tried to connect the pieces that were suddenly no longer separate. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the controlled silence of corporate structure. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something changes completely, the kind that holds a realization that cannot be undone. Emily sat at the head of the table, composed, grounded, and fully aware that the moment they had all been moving toward had finally arrived, whether they were ready for it or not. The realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like something Daniel had always known but never allowed himself to fully see. His eyes stayed locked on Emily, no longer searching, but beginning to recognize, the details aligning in a way that made everything feel both clearer and more unsettling at the same time. The way she held herself, the calm certainty in her voice, the quiet confidence that he had mistaken for passivity, it all started to make sense in a way that left no room for denial. "Emily," he said, her name coming out softer than expected, almost uncertain, as if saying it out loud would confirm something he was not ready to face. The room shifted again, this time with a visible reaction. Subtle movements from the executives, exchanged glances that carried a quiet acknowledgement. They already knew. Of course they knew. Robert turned sharply toward Daniel, then back to Emily, his expression changing from confusion to disbelief, his mind racing through every conversation, every assumption, every moment he had dismissed without a second thought. "That is not possible," he said under his breath, though the conviction in his voice was already fading. Emily did not react to the disbelief, she did not rush to clarify or defend, she simply allowed the truth to settle into the room at its own pace. Then, with the same calm presence she had maintained from the beginning, she spoke. "It is," she said. There was no emphasis, no need to explain further. The weight of the moment carried the meaning on its own. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the air feeling different, heavier, as if the space around him had changed. His thoughts moved quickly, replaying every word he had said that morning, every assumption he had made, every time he had overlooked the person sitting across from him at the kitchen table. The contrast between who he thought she was and who she actually was no longer just surprising, it was undeniable. Robert's hands, once steady, now rested on the table with a tension that had not been there before. He looked at Emily again, this time not as an executive, not as a distant authority, but as someone who had been part of his life in a way he had never truly acknowledged. You are the one making this decision?" he asked, his voice no longer carrying the same confidence, now edged with something closer to uncertainty. Emily met his gaze directly, her expression composed, but no longer distant. "Yes," she replied. "I am." The simplicity of the answer removed any remaining doubt. The room remained silent, but it was no longer waiting for a decision. It was absorbing a reality that had already changed everything. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the weight of what he was processing. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, the question coming out more personal than he intended, no longer concerned with the room, with the executives, or with the structure of the meeting. Robert glanced at him, then back at Emily, the same question now forming in his own mind, though for different reasons. Emily paused for a moment, not because she needed time, but because the answer required more than just information, it required honesty. "Because I wanted to see what you valued when you did not think it would benefit you," she said, her voice steady, but now carrying something deeper, something personal that had been held back until this exact moment. Daniel felt the words settle heavily, their meaning cutting through everything else, forcing him to confront not just the situation, but himself. Robert looked down briefly, his expression tightening as the implications reached him from a different angle, the realization that the respect he believed he had earned might not have been as complete as he thought. Emily sat at the head of the table, still composed, still in control, but now no longer just the authority in the room. She was the truth that both of them had overlooked, the presence that had always been there, waiting not to be revealed but to be recognized. The weight of Emily's words did not fade after she spoke them. It settled deeper into the room, pressing against every assumption that had existed. Just minutes before. No one interrupted, no one shifted their attention away because there was nowhere else to look, nowhere else to focus. The truth had already taken over the space. Daniel sat there trying to process not just what she had revealed, but what it meant about everything he had believed. His voice, when it came again, was quieter, stripped of the confidence it once carried. "So all this time you knew," he said, his eyes searching hers, not for confirmation anymore, but for understanding. Emily did not look away. "Yes," she answered simply. Daniel nodded slowly, the realization unfolding in layers, each one heavier than the last. "You heard everything I said," he continued, his tone tightening slightly, not defensive but exposed. "Every time I questioned you, every time I—" He stopped himself, the words catching in his throat as the full weight of his own behavior became impossible to ignore. Emily remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in her expression now, not in authority but in honesty. "I heard enough," she said. The answer was not meant to accuse, but it did not soften the truth either. Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, more careful now, as if he were stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Why stay?" he asked. If you knew how we saw you, why not say something sooner? Emily paused, not because she was uncertain, but because the answer carried more than just explanation. Because what people show you when they think you have no power, she said, her voice steady, is usually the most honest version of who they are. The words landed differently this time, not just as information, but as reflection. Robert looked down at the table, his hands no longer steady, his confidence replaced with something far less certain. Years of belief, of pride in his own judgment, now felt incomplete. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, the distance between him and Emily no longer just physical, but emotional, shaped by everything he had overlooked. I thought I understood what mattered, he said quietly. Work, stability, building something real. Emily listened, her attention focused but no longer distant. Those things do matter, she replied. But they are not the only things that define value. Daniel nodded slightly, absorbing the words, though they did not bring comfort, only clarity. Around them the executives remained silent, not out of obligation, but because the conversation had moved beyond corporate structure. This was no longer about numbers or positions. It was about perspective. Emily straightened slightly in her chair, her presence returning fully to the role she held, the decision that had brought them all into that room still waiting to be finalized. She placed her hand lightly on the folder in front of her, grounding the moment back into reality. We still have a decision to make, she said, her tone shifting just enough to signal the transition. Robert looked up again, his expression now a mix of uncertainty and acceptance, the outcome no longer something he could predict with confidence. Daniel glanced at him, then back at Emily, understanding that whatever happened next would not just affect a job, but everything that came after. Emily opened the folder once more, her movements controlled, her focus clear. The silence returned, but it was different now, no longer filled with anticipation, but with consequence. She looked at Robert directly, her gaze steady, her voice calm. Before I finalize this, she said, I need to know one thing. The room held its breath, every person present aware that the next words would carry more than just professional weight. They would define what came next, not just for Robert but for all of them. Emily's question did not come immediately, and that silence before it felt longer than anything else that had happened in the room, as if time itself was waiting for something honest to surface. Robert held her gaze, no longer trying to present himself as composed or certain, but simply as he was in that moment, a man facing the consequences of what he had believed and how he had acted. What do you believe respect really means? Emily asked, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that extended far beyond the situation at hand. The question was not about policy or performance. It was about perspective. Robert inhaled slowly, his eyes lowering for a brief second before returning to hers. For the first time, he did not answer immediately. He thought about it. Not in the way he had always done, relying on experience and habit, but in a way that required him to look at himself without the comfort of certainty. I used to think it meant recognition, he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before. That if you worked hard enough, delivered enough, people would see your value and treat you accordingly. He paused, the words settling as he continued. But I realize now that I have only been looking at it from one direction. The room remained still, every person present aware that this was no longer just a response, it was a shift. Robert straightened slightly, not to regain authority, but to stand in what he was saying. Respect is also how you treat others when you think they have nothing to offer you, he added. And I did not do that well. The admission was simple, but it carried more weight than any argument he could have made earlier. Daniel looked at him, surprised, not by the words themselves, but by the honesty behind them. It was not something he had often seen from his father, not in this way. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. She turned slightly toward Daniel, her gaze shifting, bringing him into the moment. And you? She asked. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough to show that he was no longer trying to hold on to anything. I thought I was being practical, he said, focused on what matters, on what builds a future. He shook his head slightly, the realization clear in his voice. But I ignored what was already there. I measured everything by what I could see, not by what it actually was. He looked at her directly, not with confusion anymore, but with understanding that came too late to change what had already happened. I did not give you the respect you deserved. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer tense or uncertain. It was reflective. Emily closed the folder in front of her, the decision no longer just about numbers or roles, but about what had been revealed in that room. She looked at Robert first, her voice steady. You will remain in your position, she said, but under a new structure that requires accountability beyond performance. Mentorship, awareness, and leadership that reflects more than just results. Robert nodded once, accepting not just the outcome, but the meaning behind it. Then Emily turned to Daniel, her expression softening slightly, not in authority but in truth. As for us, she said, this is not something that can be decided in a meeting. Daniel nodded, understanding that this part of the story did not have a simple resolution. I know, he replied quietly. Emily stood up, signaling the end of the meeting without needing to say it directly. The executives followed, the structure of the room returning, but nothing about it felt the same. As she walked toward the door, she paused for a brief moment, her presence still carrying the same quiet strength it had from the beginning. Then she continued forward, leaving behind not just a decision, but a realization that would stay with them long after the room was empty.